The morning sun tried its best. It peeked through the blinds of Sarah's small apartment. It painted golden stripes across the worn wooden floor. But the light could not reach the shadows in her heart. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, staring into a cold cup of coffee. The world felt heavy today. It felt like a thick gray blanket was wrapped around her shoulders, pressing her down. Every breath was a chore. Every thought was a burden. She felt small and incredibly weak, like a tiny boat lost in a vast stormy sea. The silence in her apartment was deafening, amplifying the anxious whispers in her mind. She just wanted to pull the real blankets over her head and disappear. Have you ever had a day like that? A day when just getting out of bed feels like a victory? Sarah knew that feeling all too well. It wasn't just one thing that was wrong, it was everything. A pile of bills sat on the counter, each one a reminder of what she didn't have. A difficult phone call from her doctor echoed in her ears, full of uncertain words and future worries. Friends seemed distant, lost in their own busy lives. She felt completely and utterly alone in her struggle. The problems stacked up like bricks, building a wall she couldn't see over. She wondered where the strength would come from to face even one more hour, let alone the entire day. This feeling of weakness was not new, but today it was a crushing weight. She traced the rim of her coffee mug with a shaky finger. She remembered being a child, full of energy and dreams. Where did that person go? Life had a way of chipping away at your spirit piece by piece. Disappointments, heartaches, and failures had left their marks. Now, she felt like a hollowed-out version of her former self. The mirror showed a tired woman with shadows under her eyes. The strength she once had or thought she had was gone. It had been replaced by a deep, gnawing fear that she simply wasn't strong enough for this life. So she sat there, paralyzed by the sheer size of her challenges. The coffee grew colder. The sun climbed higher in the sky. But inside Sarah's world, everything was still and dark. She closed her eyes and let out a long, shaky sigh. A silent prayer formed on her lips, a simple and desperate plea. God, where are you? I can't do this anymore. I'm so weak. It was not a prayer of great faith. It was a cry from the depths of her exhaustion, a surrender. She had no grand plan. She had no hidden strength to draw upon. All she had was her weakness, and she laid it bare in the quiet of her kitchen. The specific problem looming over her today was a big presentation at work. This wasn't just any presentation. Her job was on the line. The company was downsizing, and her performance was under a microscope. The thought of standing in front of her bosses and colleagues made her stomach churn. Her hands felt clammy just thinking about it. The words she had practiced now seemed jumbled and foolish in her mind. She imagined their critical faces, their judging eyes. The fear of failure was a giant, a Goliath staring her down, and she felt like a small, unprepared David without a single stone to sling. The pressure was immense, a physical force pushing down on her chest. This fear was more than just nerves. It was tied to everything else. If she failed this presentation, she could lose her job. If she lost her job, how would she pay those bills on the counter? How would she afford the medical care she needed? One problem was connected to the next, creating a terrifying chain of potential disasters. Her mind raced down these dark paths, each one ending in a worse place than the last. This is what anxiety does. It doesn't just present a problem. It shows you a horror movie of all the things that could go wrong. Sarah felt trapped in that movie, and she couldn't find the exit. She tried to rally herself. She told herself to be strong. "You can do this," she whispered, but the words felt hollow and untrue. She had always been the dependable one, the person who could handle anything. But that was a mask she wore. Underneath, she was crumbling. This time the mask was cracking, and she feared everyone would see the scared, weak person underneath. She felt like a fraud. How could she stand up and speak with confidence when she felt so completely broken inside? The strength she was trying to find felt like a distant memory, a story about someone else. Her weakness felt like a betrayal. She was supposed to be better than this, stronger than this. Christian women were supposed to have a quiet confidence, weren't they? They were supposed to be pillars of faith. But she felt more like a pile of dust, ready to be blown away by the slightest wind. The shame of her weakness was almost as bad as the fear itself. She believed that God must be disappointed in her. Why couldn't she just trust him more? Why was she so full of fear? The questions swirled, offering no comfort, only more condemnation. She was at the bottom of a very deep pit, and she had no rope to climb out. In her moment of quiet desperation, a memory surfaced. It wasn't a loud, booming voice from heaven, it was quieter, softer. It was the memory of a Bible study from years ago. The teacher was a kind, older woman with gentle eyes. Sarah could almost see her standing there, her Bible open in her hands. She remembered the passage they had studied. It was from a letter the Apostle Paul wrote, a man who had faced unimaginable hardship, shipwrecks, beatings, constant danger. Surely a man like that was a superhero of the faith. But that wasn't what the passage said. Paul had pleaded with God to take away a thorn in his flesh, a source of great pain and weakness, and then the words came to her, clear as a bell in the quiet of her kitchen. God's answer to Paul. It floated into her mind, a lifeline thrown into her sea of despair. My grace is sufficient for you. The words were simple, unassuming, but they landed with incredible power. My grace, not your strength, not your ability, not your courage, my grace, it is enough, it is all you need. The thought was so radical it took her breath away. She had been trying so hard to find strength within herself, and she had come up empty. But the message wasn't about finding her own strength, it was about receiving God's. The verse continued to unfold in her memory. For my power is made perfect in weakness, not in spite of weakness, not after weakness is gone, in it, right in the middle of it. The idea was revolutionary. Her weakness wasn't a disqualifier, it wasn't a sign of God's disapproval. It was the very place where his power could show up and do its best work. It was the empty vessel he was waiting to fill. All her striving, all her attempts to be strong had actually been getting in the way. She had been trying to fill a cup that was already full of her own fear and effort. A single tear rolled down Sarah's cheek, but it wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of relief. The heavy blanket of despair began to feel a little lighter. She didn't have to be strong enough. She didn't have to have all the answers. She just had to be willing to be weak. She had to be willing to admit she couldn't do it on her own. It was in that admission, in that surrender, that the door opened for God's power to enter. The verse wasn't just a nice quote, it was a promise, a personal invitation from the creator of the universe to the small, scared woman sitting in her kitchen. Let me be strong for you. This divine perspective changed everything. The presentation didn't magically disappear, the bills on the counter didn't vanish, but the fear that had paralyzed her began to recede. It was replaced by a small, steady flame of courage. It wasn't her courage. It was a borrowed courage, a gift. She stood up from the table. She walked over to the sink and poured out the cold coffee. Then she made a fresh cup. As it brewed, she spoke the words out loud, letting them fill the silent apartment. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Saying them gave them even more life. She thought about the presentation again. Before, she had pictured herself standing alone, exposed and vulnerable. Now she pictured herself standing there, but not alone. She imagined God's strength as a foundation beneath her feet, His grace as armor around her. The goal was no longer to impress her bosses or to prove her own worth. The goal was simply to show up and let God's power work through her weakness. If her voice shook, that was okay. If she stumbled over a word, that was okay too. Her weakness would simply be a spotlight for His strength. This shift in her thinking was incredibly liberating. The pressure was off. She opened her laptop and looked at her presentation slides. She didn't feel like a superhero. She still felt nervous. But it was a different kind of nervous now. It was mixed with a quiet anticipation, a curiosity to see what God would do. She wasn't relying on her own eloquence or charm. She was relying on His grace, and His grace was enough. She walked out of her apartment that morning not as a warrior marching into battle, but as a child holding her father's hand. She was still small, and the world was still big. But she was no longer alone, and she was no longer relying on her own limited resources. The moral of this story is simple, yet profound. We all face mountains. We all have days where we feel utterly weak, where the challenges of life seem too heavy to bear. In those moments, we have a choice. We can try to muster our own strength, which often fails. Or we can embrace our weakness as an opportunity for God's power to be displayed. His strength is not a prize for the strong. It is a gift for the weak. When you feel you can't go on, remember His promise. His grace is enough, for His power is made perfect not in our strength but in the very moments we feel we have none left. Trust in Him, you'll get through this.